Hello everyone, welcome to the course Strategic Management Accounting. This course will provide a critical exploration of the manner in which management accounting has reinvented itself into strategic management accounting in order to address a set of strategic challenges brought about by the recent global transformations in the competitive conditions. This course has 9 interrelated topics. This is the topic 1, Strategic Management Accounting, the emergence, definitions, and the domains of operations. This topic concentrates on 3 foundational themes. The first one is what I call the strategic turn. The wider set of contextual and epistemic factors that underlined the emergence of strategic management accounting. Secondly, we will talk about some basic definitions and concepts that differentiate strategic management accounting from conventional management accounting. Thirdly, we will talk about 3 interrelated domains or sites in which strategies are enabled and enacted differently. And as a result, strategic management accounting came into being in different forms. These are the 3 foundational themes that we deal with in this particular topic. And this topic is delivered in 2 lectures. In this lecture, we will mainly concentrate on the first theme, strategic turn. In the next lecture, we will talk about the second and the third themes. As a learning objective for this particular lecture, after following this lecture and after reading the recommended readings for this topic, you should be able to describe and explain contextual and epistemic factors that underlined the emergence of strategic management accounting. During the last 30 years or so, various notions of strategy have been populated as critical elements of the way we manage our organizations today. Not only private sector organizations, but also public sector and civil society organizations. Various notions of strategy, such as, for example, strategic vision, strategic mission, strategic thinking, strategic leadership, strategic planning, strategy implementation, strategic management control systems, and strategic performance management systems have been populated and popularized as essential ingredients of contemporary management. The strategic consultancy has become a multi-billion industry. Not only consultancy firms such as Boston Consultancy and McKinsey, but also the large accountancy firms such as KPMG and PwC are now providing various forms of strategy consultancy, not only for private sector organizations, but also for public sector and civil society organizations. Strategy gurus, strategy consultants, and strategic managers have become high earning intellectuals in the contemporary world. Various courses that we offer in the business schools, as well as by professional accountancy bodies, are now trying to become strategic. As a result, we have strategic management, strategic marketing, strategic human resource management, strategic operations management, strategic finance, as well as strategic management accounting. Organizations are spending millions of money in enhancing the strategic capacities of the firms. They have specialized training programs to improve the strategic thinking of the corporate managers. They have specialized training programs to enhance strategic implementation and strategic planning and so on. And they are investing millions of dollars in designing and implementing various strategic management control systems, including strategic performance management systems such as balanced scorecards. So it is this signification of strategy and strategy discourses which I call the strategic turn. In other words, what I mean by the term strategic turn is the political, economic, institutional, and techno-managerial signification of the notion and discourses of strategy. So, what lies behind this strategic turn? In other words, what are the historical factors or forces that created this signification of strategy as a critical element of the way we manage our organizations today? Of course, one can think about so many different factors. However, for the purpose of having a broader conceptual understanding about the way strategic management accounting came into being, I would classify these factors into two major categories. First one is what I call contextual factors, and the second one is epistemic factors. The contextual factors in a broader sense talk about the political economic, techno-managerial, and institutional transformations, which created a new set of globalized competition, digitalized and virtualized competition. So under the heading of contextual factors, we will talk about political economic, techno-managerial, and institutional transformations or institutional factors. And then under the heading of epistemic, we talk about a specific set of epistemic institutions or knowledge creation institutions that underlined the popularization and creation of various forms of strategy discourses. So, under the heading contextual factors, we talk about wider political, economic, institutional, and techno-managerial factors. And under the heading epistemic, we talk about how a particular body of knowledge known as strategy came into being through various sort of knowledge-related institutions, knowledge creation activities and processes and actors. Now, when it comes to the contextual factors, as I already mentioned, our attention should be broadly on three key aspects. First one is the political economic. Second one is institutional. Third one is techno managerial. Accordingly, I would identify three key factors under the heading of contextual. The first one is neoliberalization of politics. That is, the creation of a new set of political ideologies and political economic systems, which happened during the last 30 or 40 years. Then, secondly, we can talk about globalization of markets and hierarchies. How markets became globalized through global brands, global consumption, global firms, global supply chains, and so on. And not only that, under the globalization of markets and hierarchies, we would talk about how the regulation and governance of businesses became globalized through various kind of global regulatory institutions and infrastructures. Then thirdly, we talk about techno-managerial aspect of the transformation under the heading digitalization and virtualization of technologies and management. So these are the three key forces or transformations that I would call in a broader sense contextual factors which created the strategic turn in strategic management accounting. Or those are the key underlying historical transformations which provided the necessary context within which management accounting became strategic management accounting. Let us now talk about the first contextual factor, neoliberalization of politics. Our overall aim here is to explain how neoliberalization provided the necessary political context within which management accounting became strategic management accounting. In doing that, we have to first understand what do we mean by neoliberalization. And in order to understand what do we mean by neoliberalization, we have to first understand the nature of the political economic system we had before neoliberalization. The political economic system we had before neoliberalization was nothing like what we are having today. The political states were protectionist. Politicians, political parties, and the political state in general thought that global is a potential threat for the domestic or the local. Therefore, the local producers, local markets should be protected from the global. As a result, imports were heavily restricted through various means of import restrictions in order to protect the domestic producers and the domestic output markets. Free flow of labor were heavily restricted through various means of immigration and migration controls in order to protect the domestic labor markets. The free flow of capital were heavily restricted through various forms of exchange controls in order to protect the domestic capital markets. Then, when it comes to the domestic industries, Large industries, large corporations were owned and managed by the state through the state bureaucracy. The state bureaucracy was the prominent and the dominating institutional structure that governed and regulated and managed the industries. Markets were not considered to be the ultimate mechanism or ultimate institution of governance. The market is to be governed and regulated by the state through various forms of price controls, subsidies, and taxes, and so on. So, the economy was heavily regulated and by and large owned by the state and managed by the state and governed by the state. The political aim was the welfareism. Industries were owned, managed, and governed by the state in order to provide various forms of welfare provisions. So that is the world we had before neoliberalization. A protectionist states trying to protect the local or domestic from the global. State owned, nationalized organizations, corporations managed through state bureaucracy. And welfareism as the political aim. Then, the Reagan government in the US and the Thatcherian government in the UK started a massive political economic transformation. With the epistemic support of economists such as Milton Friedman, and with the institutional support of World Bank, IMF, and OECD, and so on, the Reagan government and the Thatcherian government opened up the economies, relaxed the import and export duties, relaxed the foreign exchange controls, relaxed the immigration and migration controls to facilitate the free flow of labor, at least within certain global regions such as European Union. So neoliberalization involves opening up the economy. The global is considered to be not a threat but an opportunity. So global is understood to be a mean through which the economic development can be achieved. So globalization is embraced. And then economies were privatized. Instead of the government bureaucracy, a private sector structures and systems of management were put in place. Even the government-owned enterprises were to be transformed through private sector style of management, including new public administration, new public management. Welfareism as a political ideology, as a political aim, was discarded. Instead, the market austerity was introduced. So that is what we mean by neoliberalization. Opening up the economies, considering the global as an opportunity, thinking about the globalization as most suitable mode of economic development, privatization of domestic production, industries, and so on, and discarding welfareism to be replaced by market austerity. Now, how do we connect this neoliberalization to the emergence of strategic management accounting? That is our key question. Now, this neoliberalization of politics In all these dynamics, created a new competitive condition, new globalized competitive condition. So at this particular point, we have to emphasize a specific proposition about strategy. It is the competitive conditions that necessitate strategies. Strategies are there to deal with competition. So when the competitive conditions change, then organizations or firms need new strategies. So because of this neoliberalization, the markets were opened, labor movement were facilitated, capital movement were facilitated. The result was creation of a totally new globalized competitive condition, one which is characterized by global consumption, global production, global firms, global brands, and global supply chains. That is what neoliberalization created. And this new competitive condition then demanded a new set of calculative practices, a new set of rationalization practices in order to analyze, in order to understand, and in order to deal with this new competitive or market conditions. So what do we mean by strategic management accounting is this new set of calculative practices, this new set of rationalization practices. So that is the connection between neoliberalization and the emergence of strategic management accounting. To repeat it again, neoliberalization of politics provided the necessary political context by creating new, globalized, open, competitive conditions. And that new competitive condition then demanded a new set of calculations, a new set of calculative techniques, a new set of rationalization techniques. And it is this new set of calculative and rationalization techniques which we now call strategic management accounting. So that is the connection. We are now moving to the second contextual factor, globalization of markets and hierarchies, which is highly interrelated and somewhat overlapping with the neoliberalization of politics. Both the neoliberalization of politics and the globalization of markets ultimately resulted in the same outcome: globalized competitive conditions. However, the difference is that neoliberalization of politics captures the politico-ideological dimension of the transformation, whereas the globalization captures the institutional dimension of the transformation. In a broader sense, globalization involves three key elements or themes. The first one is globalization of markets. Second one, globalization of organizational hierarchies. And third one is globalization of regulatory infrastructure. When it comes to the market dimension, globalization means bringing together geographically, politically, and culturally dispersed consumers and producers through global marketing platforms and global supply chains. So accordingly, the globalization of markets involves global consumers, global brands, global firms, global supply chains, and global marketing platforms. We now have a set of consumers who are willing and able to buy global brands, irrespective of their national, political, and cultural identities. We have a set of consumers who are willing and able to be loyal to global brands, irrespective of their political, cultural, and national identities. So that is the emergence of global consumers or the global pattern of consumption. Then we have global brands and global firms, multinational corporations. And to bring these global consumers and global producers together, we have global marketing platforms as well as global supply chains. So to repeat, the market dimension of globalization involves the emergence of global consumption or consumers, global producers and brands, global supply chains, and global marketing platforms. As a result, we have global markets, mega markets. However, it should be emphasized here that these global markets, these mega markets are not mass markets. Instead, they are highly differentiated, highly fragmented, highly stratified on the basis of geographical differences, political differences, cultural differences, and so on. Therefore, corporate managers now have a new set of challenges. How to deal with these highly differentiated, highly fragmented, highly stratified markets. So they have to carry out a new set of calculations. They have to have a new set of rationalizations to deal with this new global competitive conditions, global markets. When it comes to hierarchies, now we have multinational corporations, organizations whose operations are now expanded beyond national boundaries. So we have corporations whose head offices may be located in, for example, Tokyo, New York, London, Beijing, Paris, and so on. And they are factories, they are call centers, they are warehouses, they are distribution centers are located all over the world. So the hierarchy is globalized. So they have to coordinate, they have to integrate these geographically, globally dispersed production entities, production facilities, distribution facilities, and head offices, and so on. And in these globalized hierarchies, now we have people working from all over the world, from different cultures, from different nations, from different geographical regions, with different ideologies, and so on. So the organizations have become cosmopolitan, and accordingly, the management has to be cosmopolitan. The management has to appreciate and embrace diversity. So diversity management is a key issue. So this is what happened to the organizational hierarchies now. So that is what we call the globalization of hierarchies. Then, to regulate, to govern these globalized markets and these globalized hierarchies, the world needed a new regulatory infrastructure, a new set of regulatory institutions. As a result, we now have global regulatory bodies, for example, such as International Standard Organization, ISO, and we have now global accounting standard setters, and we have various other regulatory institutions to deal with, for example, money laundering, corruption, modern slavery, and so on. And we have various organizations to deal with various transactions between global banks, such as Basel Committee. So the regulation has been globalized. So in an overall sense, what we mean by globalization is these three elements: globalization of markets, globalization of hierarchies, and the globalization of regulatory infrastructure. Then our fundamental question: how do we connect globalization with the emergence of strategic management accounting? As we did in the case of neoliberalization, we have to now emphasize our basic strategy proposition. That is, strategies are necessitated. Strategies are made important. Strategies are enabled and enacted on the basis of competitive conditions or to deal with competitive conditions. So, when we have new competitive conditions, we have to think about strategies. So, similar to neoliberalization, globalization also created a new set of competitive conditions. Globalized competitive conditions. And these new globalized competitive conditions now demands a new set of calculative and rationalization techniques. And it is these new set of calculative and rationalization techniques which we now call strategic management accounting. Digitalization and virtualization of technologies and management is the third contextual factor that underlined the strategic turn in management accounting. As you experience from your day-to-day life, you can easily understand that we are now in a totally different world compared to what we had 30 or 40 years ago. All our activities, our production activities, our consumption, our exchange, our investment, and our savings, they are all now carried out in a different manner on digital and virtual platforms. Our production systems are now computer-aided designs, and our manufacturing systems are now computer-aided manufacturing. And we have 3D printing, and we have cloud-based coordination, controlling and regulation of these manufacturing facilities all over the world. And we have global, virtual, digitalized enterprise resource planning systems. So that is when we are talking about the production systems. Then we buy and we sell in online market platforms such as Amazon, eBay, Alibaba, and so on. And we have various forms of digital and virtual technologies to coordinate between our supply chains. And we pay using various forms of online payment systems such as PayPal. So our production, our consumption, our exchange, our savings, our investment, not only that, our social relations, our social activities are now being facilitated based upon various forms of digital and virtual conditions, virtual platforms, including, for example, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. So this is what we mean by digitalization and virtualization. And this has created, as in the case of neoliberalization of politics, and as in the case of globalization of markets and hierarchies, this digitalization and virtualization interconnectedly, together with the other two contextual factors, have now created highly globalized, digitalized, and virtualized competitive conditions, which now creates a new set of challenges, including new issues related to health and safety, ethics, regulation, governance, and so on. And this new competitive condition then demands a new set of calculations, new set of rationalizations, new set of controlling and regulatory practices. And it is that new set of calculative, regulatory, and rationalization techniques and practices which we now call strategic management accounting. So it is the same logic to connect this third contextual factor with the emergence of strategic management accounting. As in the case of the other two factors, so this factor as well created a new set of competitive conditions, which demanded a new set of calculations, new set of rationalizations, new set of governance and control practices, which constitute strategic management accounting. Now, to summarize what we discussed so far under the heading of contextual factors, we identified three contextual factors. Neoliberalization of politics, which captured the politico-ideological dimension of the strategic term. Then we had globalization of markets and hierarchies, which captured the institutional dynamics of strategic turn. Then thirdly, we discussed digitalization and virtualization of technologies and management, which captures the techno-managerial dimension of the strategic turn. All these dimensions, all these dynamics, interrelatedly, interconnectedly, created a new set of competitive conditions, globalized, digitalized, virtualized competition. Mega markets, highly fragmented, highly stratified, highly segmented markets. And organizational hierarchies, highly dispersed but globally coordinated, globally integrated. Global connections between producers and consumers through global supply chain networks and global marketing platforms. And this new competitive condition then demands a new set of rationalizations, a new set of calculative practices. And it is this new set of calculative and rationalization techniques and practices which we now call strategic management accounting. So that is how these contextual factors provided the political, economic, ideological, then institutional, and techno-managerial context upon which strategic management accounting was necessitated and came into being. With that summary of contextual factors, we can now talk about epistemic factors that underlined the strategic turn in management accounting. By the term episteme or epistemic, what I mean are those factors related to the production and reproduction of knowledge. In the case of strategic management accounting, the epistemic factors, therefore, constitute those factors or dynamics that produced and reproduced strategic management accounting as a distinct field of study. Epistemic, or the knowledge, constitute the way we understand, the way we appreciate, the way we cognize, the way we criticize, the way we judge the world around us and within us. And that epistemic or knowledge would constitute various conceptual elements. For example, the knowledge or the episteme would constitute ideological doctrines, political doctrines, religious doctrines, theoretical doctrines, theoretical frameworks, concepts, standards, guidelines, and so on. So these are what I call conceptual elements of the epistemic content. So those are the things that constitute a particular discipline as a body of knowledge, as a distinct body of knowledge. Now, in that sense, strategic management accounting exists, came into being, and will be reproduced through a set of concepts, theories, conceptual frameworks, models, and so on. And during the last 30 years or so, we have seen that a new set of frameworks, a new set of concepts, and new set of models have been introduced to reinvent management accounting as strategic management accounting. These would include, for example, balanced scorecards, activity-based costing and management, strategic cost management, quality costing, enterprise resource planning, and so on. There are a large number of new models and frameworks introduced by various people, various institutions to create, recreate, produce, and reproduce management accounting as strategic management accounting. And such developments I would call conceptual development. So the epistemic factors would constitute conceptual developments. Then, such conceptual developments would not come out of the blue. They needed to be associated with a particular epistemic institutional infrastructure. The epistemic institutions play a critical role, a dominating role in creating disciplines such as management accounting, strategic management, marketing, and so on. Universities, consultancy bodies, professional accountancy bodies, or any other professional institutions would constitute such institutional framework. For example, the balanced scorecard would not become what it is now. It may not become such a popular framework of strategic management accounting without the Johnson and Kaplan being associated with a university like Harvard and other consultancy firms. Similarly, activity-based costing, activity-based management would not become what it is now without that being associated with a particular institutional infrastructure. Consultancy firms, universities, business schools, professional bodies, and so on. So, in a broader sense, the epistemic development or epistemic factors include conceptual development and institutional development. Both these factors together interconnectedly produce and reproduce disciplines, including strategic management accounting. One of the key institutional development that underlined the emergence of a strategic turn is the emergence and the growth and the popularization of consultocracy, the emergence of consultancy business. As I mentioned earlier, the consultancy has now become a multi-billion industry. The strategic consultancy is very critical in this sense. So various consultancy firms such as Boston Consultancy Group and the McKinsey has produced various strategic management frameworks. And those frameworks as conceptual elements now populate strategic management accounting. So consultancy should be understood as one of the key institutional development that provided a necessary institutional infrastructure within which management accounting became strategic management accounting. So in order to summarize the epistemic factors, what I mean by epistemic factors are those factors which are related to the production and reproduction of strategic management accounting as a specific field of knowledge. And these epistemic factors can broadly be explained with or under two interrelated headings: conceptual developments and the institutional developments, which are highly interrelated. The conceptual developments include the introduction of new models, new frameworks, new concepts, new standards, and so on. Institutional developments include emergence of new institutional elements through which such concepts, such theories are being invented, reinvented, and popularized. So that's the epistemic factors. Now, with that, we have reached the end of this particular lecture. So, to summarize, this lecture was mainly concentrated on the strategic turn, which is the first element of the first topic. So this topic was the strategic management accounting, the emergence, definitions, and the domains of operations. In this lecture, we concentrated on the first element, the emergence, whereas we will be discussing the definitions and the domains of operations in the next lecture. So what I meant by the strategic turn is the recent signification of strategy and strategy discourses as a critical element of the way we manage our organizations today. Not only private sector organizations, but also public sector and civil society organizations. It is the political, economic, institutional, and techno-managerial signification of the notions of strategy and strategy discourses. That is what I meant by the strategic turn. Then we ask the question, what lies behind this strategic turn? And we identified mainly two categories of factors: contextual factors and the epistemic factors. The contextual factors captured the politico-ideological, institutional, and techno-managerial transformations that brought the strategic turn in management accounting up. And those contextual factors we discussed under three headings: neoliberalization of politics, which captured the politico-ideological dimension; then globalization of markets and hierarchies, which captured the institutional dynamics of the strategic turn; then thirdly, digitalization and virtualization of technologies and management, which captured the techno-managerial dimension of the strategic turn. All these three contextual elements interrelatedly, interconnectedly, created a new set of competitive conditions: global, digitalized, virtualized competitive conditions, characterized by global consumers and consumption, global brands and producers, global supply chains, and global marketing platforms, which are operating on digital and virtual conditions. And these new competitive conditions then demanded a new set of rationalization and calculative techniques. And it is those new set of calculative and rationalization techniques which we now call strategic management accounting. So that is how the contextual factors ultimately resulted in management accounting being reinvented as strategic management accounting. Then, when it comes to the epistemic factors, we concentrated on conceptual and institutional dynamics, which help the production and reproduction of strategic management accounting as a distinct field of study. And that discussion can be organized around two interrelated dimensions: conceptual developments and institutional developments. So while the contextual factors created the new competitive conditions, the epistemic factors provided the necessary knowledge base, provided the necessary epistemic conditions or epistemic base upon which that new competitive conditions can be analyzed, understood, and managed. So that's how we see the strategic turn. So this diagram summarizes what we discussed so far. So thank you very much for following this lecture, and see you again in the next lecture.